Hey everybody, this is Anne, and this week our story has been about Hannah. And when I was a kid, it was one of my favorite stories in the Bible, probably because it was about a woman who had a name. There aren't many of those. I tended to be drawn to those as a kid. Go figure. So this was one of my favorites. But as I got older, it became less so because it's about a woman who can't have a child, goes and prays in a very public, dramatic fashion in front of God and everybody for a child, and it says God remembers her and she has a baby. Now, I'm sure if you are listening to this, either you have struggled or you love someone who has struggled with infertility issues. You've known somebody who has wanted to have a baby, has tried to have a baby, a person of really great faith who has prayed about having a family and wanting a family and still cannot get pregnant. So I would get angry at this story because it made people feel as if the problem was they weren't faithful. If they were only faithful enough, then God would have granted them a baby like God did for Hannah. And for that story to make someone feel that way, or for anyone to use that story to make someone feel that way, is spiritual and biblical malpractice. It's a horrible way to use the story because the story is about so much more. It is about a woman who wants a baby, but it's not a story of infertility. It is a story of a God who helps the marginalized, the outsider, and the forgotten. Because even though we are still battling misogyny in this world, there is still sexism, women still don't make as much as men, there are all sorts of issues we still have to overcome in regards to the role of women in our society, in our workplaces. It is really hard for us to imagine what it was like to be a woman then. For a woman not to have a child, specifically not to have a son, meant that if something should happen to her husband, she had zero standing in the community. In those days, a woman had to be attached to a man to have any sort of protection, to have any sort of standing, to have any sort of worth at all. So this wasn't just an issue of the hunger of Hannah's heart to bear a child, which I'm sure was very real. This was a safety issue. This was a justice issue. If Hannah did not have a child, she would most likely be left on the margins of society. She would eventually become an outcast. Chances are she was going to outlive her husband, and she would be left with nothing and no one. So this is one of many stories of God helping those who are on the margins, helping the outcast, helping the outsider. And Hannah makes mention of these in her prayer, in her song that later becomes Mary's song when she is pregnant with Jesus. And it is a song, you can listen to it in our Bible Stories for Big Kids podcast, but she talks over and over again about God lifting up the lowly and giving the hungry stuff to eat, and women who are childless to have a full household. It's all about God flipping the script. And those who are without, those who are on the outside, are living in abundance and welcomed inside. So, and that is a story that carries on with Jesus. Jesus modeled that for us time and time again, reaching out to the outsider, the tax collector, the prostitute, the woman who'd been married 5 times, the Syrophoenician, all sorts of people who others considered untouchable, unwanted, zero standing in society. Jesus continued to reach out, to lift up, and to welcome in those people. And that's what we're called to do. That's the very reason that we have pride celebrations. I mean, they've been a little less celebratory this year, obviously, but we celebrate LGBTQ pride because these are people who have been not always and still not always welcome, people who have been left on the margins, people who have not traditionally been lifted up, but should be. We don't have straight pride because straight people have been included and accepted since time began. So we have gay pride, LGBTQ pride, to lift up those who have often been pushed down. And that's why we say Black Lives Matter. Not because we don't think all lives matter. Of course, all lives matter. But we call out Black Lives Matter because those lives have been marginalized and devalued. Because women, moms whose children have dark skin, have to be much more afraid for their children than I have to be for my blonde and blue-eyed daughter. And that is not right. And that is why we say Black Lives Matter, so that we acknowledge the disparity and we start to do something about it. And whenever in our lives we raise up and call out a person or a people who have been marginalized or cast aside, there is no way around it. We are doing the work of the gospel. We are doing God's work. And we need to remember that. And I say that not so much for the sake of people who are marginalized, but for those of us who aren't. It is so important that we continue to do the work of the gospel. And here's why. I mean, there's a number of reasons why, but here's the reason I'm giving right now. The story of Hannah marks a turning point in the Old Testament. This is the point in which we move from, the Israelites were wandering in the desert for a while, and they got settled and they scattered. And there was a time when the judges ruled the land, and different judges ruled over different tribes and groups of people, and everybody was scattered about. But God uses Hannah, this woman who was in danger of being cast aside and forgotten. God uses Hannah to usher in this new era of kings, in which the children of Israel, in which the tribes of Israel, the children of the covenant, would be united under one leader. And God uses Hannah and Hannah's promise to God because she kept it. When her son was born, she dedicated him to service to God, and he became a priest. And in fact, was the priest who chose and anointed David to be the king of Israel and the uniter of the Hebrew children. God's always doing stuff like that. God not only remembers forgotten people, God uses them for God's purposes. And we should really pay attention to that right now, because we're certainly in a shift in our time. COVID has shifted everything. The church is changing. The church has changed, and it will continue to change. Church is not going to look like it did. We're never going to go back to the way it was before. I can say that to you because none of you attend my church. I'm not your pastor, and you can't fire me. But church is not going to look the same, is not going to go back to the way it was. We are in the middle of a shift. And we need to pay attention to who God is using to help us make this shift. If we start to discount people who we think God couldn't possibly call, if we start to ignore the people on the margins, if we fail to pay attention to those who need to be lifted up, we may be really missing the boat. In fact, we are really missing the boat on where and who God is calling us to be as the Church of Jesus Christ. God is doing something new here, folks. Something new is being ushered in. And we need to make places and spaces for all sorts of different people to be a part of that. Our God is the God of the forgotten and the cast aside. And God continues to use those people to do great and good things in this world. We should probably pay attention to that.